China, English, Education by Sean McHugh, May 2026, Part 2 of 5. After some discussion at the Nanjing contract about university-produced material in English needing proofreading, I was offered part-time paid work in addition to the contract. However, the longer tracts of Chinese English they had in mind aren't practical because of the enormous efforts in trying to untangle their confused intentions and messy thinking in the first place, or what instead they should be trying to say. It's far easier if they just outline their needs and I write it for them after decoding their intentions, and at this point the offers went no further. Proofreading one's own writing with complex content is demanding, and even more so when taking on others, while a glance at the level of error makes it clear that they don't know what's involved and don't know that they don't know. Learning materials and exams prepared by Chinese speakers who've learned English, unfortunately, are favored under socialist self-sufficiency and Chinese pride, rather than by native English speakers who've learned Chinese. Any errors should be on the Chinese side, where they don't matter, not the English. At most, they use a Chinese book that's been brushed up by an English speaker, but with most of its substandard content retained, while book covers may fraudulently state a British Oxbridge press. Moreover, the process of drafting and proofreading written English to provide a concise statement and where the writer's intentions and content are clarified in the process compares with engaging practically with and adapting to reality and its endless complications as leading on to objective scientific and technological reasoning. Alternatively, they'll say their meaningless and bonkers formations are common in China, as though any violation and muddling of the language's underlying logic is a matter of local practice, equivalent to British or American or Australian English, despite those being first language-speaking countries, where by contrast, the subtle basics are generally understood, and issues of dialect secondary. They double-think their way around the fact that if native speakers can't understand what they think they're saying, then there is no common language and no point in trying to learn it. As in other developing countries, they're innocent of greater linguistic and societal complexity. Usually, there are no regular staff meetings to discuss what's working and isn't, foreground and solve problems, make suggestions, share materials and methods, raise an infinite array of issues, recognize efforts, reinforce staff relations, and generally augment efforts for the students under professional responsibility and ethics, with all these being to one side of Chinese control culture. Even when meetings are held, it's more to be polite to Western expectation and listen insincerely, rather than any intention for substantive results, while no one takes minutes or email summaries to clarify what is said and done or action to be taken. Simple requests that would involve the managers in lateral contact with other parts of the organization are unlikely to be attended to where society instead is based on command from the next hierarchical tier, extending up to unimpeachable authority and high politics, while normal attention to problem solving stays only with immediate daily concerns. Meetings as inherently dynamic and critical, with perspectives raised, are threatening to irreproachable socialism with its fixed command system and are quashed and presupposed out of existence. Structured lateral association between staff of any kind is a threat to authority to be circumvented, and instead, neurotic disjunctions and disagreements typically build up between the Westerners across each semester under a subtle divide-and-rule policy. The occasional voices for improvement in the system are stifled because its real purpose of people control and containment, plus lies about learning, is already achieved. Suggestions are also met with the self-evident understanding that a single person on their own is unable to see something that the state and wider Chinese groupthink hasn't already seen. But for politeness' sake, such Westerners are treated as a novelty, consoled as though they must have had a rough day, and told to look on the bright side. Moreover, by contrast, semester induction presentations by the management may feature recounting of common sense and how being drunk or late for work isn't acceptable, where normal levels of personal responsibility aren't expected, and instead people, including Westerners, always need shepherding. Furthermore, there's a policy throughout the Chinese education system of women managers predominating, where the feminine disposition is less suited to foregrounding and directly addressing and solving workplace problems to get things done. There is circuitousness, indifference, and psychological games played with men, appropriate in other settings, but here instead being at one with the obfuscation and stagnation. Rather than tabling issues for transparent analysis, women think, what fun, I have power over him, and obviously I'm going to say nothing. Their holistic thinking perfectly complements and is ultimately superior to masculine linear thinking, but is opposed to decisive action and dynamic work environments. However, during much of First Nanjing Contract, with managers having lived and worked or studied in Ireland and Britain, and following my suggestions, meetings were held 3 weekly and chaired by different Westerners, with minutes taken. Nonetheless, the background idea remained that the process of people on a similar level meeting to talk is unserious or impudent when the government is there to do that, while less confident Western staff were unhappy at having to think about their teaching and organize thoughts in providing something to say, even while complaining to each other about their issues privately. As in Western universities, staff recruitment makes no effort to select for genuine independence of mind beyond given paradigms, and instead, the goal is fitting in to serve the institution's student socialization and tempering for the wider society's status quo. Staff as well as students are selected for maximum rationality plus minimum criticality to make good but unquestioning workers. Indeed, staff with lower ability looking for a fake and bandaged institutional existence to identify with over real life are favored for the social system's inertia, regardless of the problems and injustice to students and others it causes. People are programmable automatons with nothing to say, and where things to listen to come from above and not from the side or below. Yet managers also have the subtle tension of the state's foreign assistance requirements as indicating the system's non-completeness. China's a huge prison where socialist fake harmony displaces personal views, ideas, and contributions, while featuring undeveloped society's lack of differentiation and foregrounding to deal with problems. Then managers are promoted into position seemingly by demonstrating blind obedience while having no more problem-solving or dynamism than anyone else. Harmony here is the worst kind of majoritarian tyranny, where insight beyond the sheep herd means discord and trouble. Rather than reality having infinite possibility, it's assumed to be subject to fixed principles in a determinate theoretical system, which has been duly discovered as Chinese socialism. All further discussion about society and politics, and by extension anything non-trivial in life as ultimately a subset of these, is unnecessary and erroneous, where even if you're a complete Maoist Marxist and enthusiastic about the Chinese system, you also keep quiet. By contrast, however, values of individuality are higher than values of society, even for the Chinese, so that the more capable, who understand, can rise and take society forward. A set of presuppositions and norms are indeed needed to identify with for the less conscious, as comprising most of a society's natural capability pyramid. But norms nonetheless can have background criticality as creating an environment allowing all minds to flourish, and which is given roughly by the individualism of capitalist politics. Uncritical minds are averse to individual and critical perspectives as they undermine them and their current culture and worldview, but ultimately they respect and are proud of such perspectives and want them embodied and prioritized in their cultural background. They know that the unthinking and equalized masses that socialism prioritizes can't take society forward and raise its standards. China instead has only a weakly insightful bureaucracy as democratically representative of the moronic masses, while claiming vaguely to stand for good values. An unchallenged whitewashing example in English tuition is a nationwide practice in audio recordings for listening exercises and exams, where no time at all is given between the questions for the students or anyone else to think or answer, and instead all are to be answered at the end when they've been forgotten. The managers and Chinese invigilators defend this loony absurdity by the recording being uselessly repeated, along with the usual glib assurances. The management response to my reporting this problem in exams was to require future students taking them to buy headphones to listen to the recording, instead of being broadcast on loudspeakers, so that native speaker invigilators couldn't hear it. There is refusal to acknowledge a problem where the necessary consciousness isn't there, and instead contradictory facts are placed side by side. Prioritizing a received collective system and downgrading individual observation mean issues aren't brought to attention, but smudged over and lied about as required. This practice in recordings is continuous, with typed English having no gaps between sections nor after punctuation, and being a uniform, meaningless, pompous mess. Chinese writing isn't broken into architectonic and articulating sentences conducive to thought as the normal reasoning process of observing anomalies, then finding explanatory premises and coming to conclusions. And instead, the whole idea of a gap with nothing filling it doesn't arise. In listening, writing, or in personal life generally, people don't pause to consider and use reasoning outside of the provided state worldviews. In taking gross surfaces and depthlessness as basic, they also try to copy the blurred and elided sounds of regular, rapidly spoken native speech, thinking that's right because it's how it may sound, instead of referring to writing for how the language properly works. Chinese culture is oral rather than literary, where people learn by listening and parroting, as continuous with a lack of original thinking. Accordingly, on another occasion, when preparing my own listening exams, I was encouraged not to use my own voice, but an undeveloped text-to-speech computer program, as producing mindless, robotic results, in disregard for the sentence structure and phrasing that they're largely unaware of. Moreover, breaks in university teaching sessions are given at fixed times by bells, jingles, and announcements in fake endearing tones, telling students to leave and return as serving continuity with schooling and emphasizing lack of responsibility to keep them in place. Break times being fixed for all groups further means washroom cues, in contrast to random times issued by the lecturers as suiting whatever is taking place in their sessions, while the Zuhai breaks were a brainless short 5 minutes, adding to a mindlessly driven atmosphere. Teaching room computers provide another offensive toy xylophone jingle at high volume to get a baby's attention when you switch them on, while for university students in their 20s, to be absent from a session, they should get a foolish stamped note from an office, all as for school children. There are typically also rows of chairs plus desks, with these typically fixed, instead of just chairs with at most an arm surface for writing during lectures. But with movable furniture, I often stack the desks at the back and the seating forward, to the students' surprise, but which always sharpens their attention. Again, the tendency for institutional stasis, ignoring the individual, compares with the Chinese language and its lack of phonetics and spelling to know independently how to say words, and instead having only to listen closely to others speaking them. People parrot each other without independent knowing or checking via phonetic reading, and where instead there is relativity of truth, and hence precedent and bureaucracy. In China, language and subsequently reasoning connote the input of others, whereas in the West, the individual can work them out themselves and look for principles beyond others. That segues into science. While insight and innovation isn't needed, as they're being disingenuously imported from the West in this period. The written character's rough semantics over unrealized further potential detail parallels the Chinese notion of a simple reality, and hence skating and whitewashing over detailed thought, while the international Roman script transliteration system of Pinyin was only introduced in 1958. A historically weakly literate population attending more to their language's outward sounds also situates it as a controllable, ignorant proletariat rather than a self-empowering middle class. A regular casual speaker in any language is only concerned to be understood and convey their information, and hence their diction and grammar is less important. But written English, with its complexity, precision, and density, unexpectedly emerging beyond speech, provides a crystalline information storage system and record that must be formally correct to be meaningful. Non-English or non-Western language speakers don't know this and assume that writing is just as casual as speaking, where any sketchy words or formations that come to the writer's mind at that moment are just fine for use, in the same way as in speaking.
All as a listener would have minimal further issue with the speaker's choice of words once they understand what they're hearing. The Chinese think that a reader would have no further issue with a writer's language once they understand what they're reading, and with the writer instead feeling only confusion or being offended. However, when the reader needs clarification, the writer is usually no longer there in live rapport, while writing with errors delimits the complexity of what can be said, and then what the society can achieve technologically.
Rather than a listener not understanding speaking and asking for further explanation in loose wording within an inherently informal conversation, a reader not understanding writing can only read the text again, and hence the more complex the content, the more carefully it must be written to be conveyed. Different languages have different potential conceptual complexity via differentiation and accuracy and other features, where the writer foregrounds, delineates, and works through their ideas before them at a desk.
With Chinese writing no more complex than speaking, if not less complex in having no pronunciation coding, reading isn't important for learning Chinese, and with the same then assumed for learning English. In English, reading good writing as the definition of the language and helping understand all its aspects is beyond them and their primitive direct transcription to a semi-pictographical script. The Chinese, as reflected in their culture and language, lack the mental resources for a developed interest in or understanding of anything, including English, and only come in at superficial and uncritical levels. The Chinese then take my whole contrasting native position on English as an identity threat, and are strongly disinclined to review their presuppositions about it, particularly with fewer Chinese having traveled abroad to experience English in authentic native contexts, nor with much grasp of the fact of other cultures at all beyond China's historical sequestration. Western staff are treated as square pegs for square holes, while seeing English in simplified and corrupted cultural relativist terms, instead of engaging with them to make sense of their Western culture's linguistic product and its qualities as enhanced beyond Chinese equivalents. Instead of the mature recognition of the international world and its diversity, there's the blinkered insistence that their perspectives are right, and by some gymnastics, the expert foreigners wrong. The national government requires that students take courses in the West's international common language and its cultures, but the local reality is that the different norms and background presuppositions are fundamental for most people, and they can't engage much with others. The imported technology and language aren't understood, and instead dealt with by a command and parrot society. Moreover, managers typically announce tasks to complete without sufficient time for the complexity involved, or events to attend without regard for prior commitments staff may have, with the presupposition that the wider administrative system is preeminent, while the person reduces to nothing. English superbly hinges on an intuitive depth and pragmatic understanding as independent of the more intellectually distinct sets of rules governing many other languages. On many levels, it's based on subtle context-dependent judgment and the user's insight into which structures seem to work where, given structures or principles in books remain secondary. However, with the Chinese English learning environment's limitations, along with errors made not affecting the exchange of only basic ideas, all being seen as unimportant, they favor their own courses and coursebooks over contact with native speakers. Nonetheless, exploration of more complex thought and concepts is beyond them anyway, while the international exams, particularly in their writing sections, as focusing on intuitive perception of data and graphs, followed by clear argumentative thinking, provide a major barrier for them. Moreover, whereas India, with similar territory and population sizes, uses English as a neutral as well as cosmopolitan internal common language between major regional domestic languages, alongside a rich British colonial heritage, China has only one main language, where English remains more alien, alongside limited European colonial involvement and instead historical sequestration. Also, the Northern Indian languages and most European languages, including English, are in the same wider family and very disjunct from Chinese.
Misunderstandings then arise, with Chinese staff thinking they're using English well enough, but aren't. For instance, with insufficient attention given to word order, as this being particularly significant for generating meaning over set formations. Not bothering to get the first two words in the right order in saying, "You are free Friday morning," when trying to tell me I have no teaching Friday morning, and instead cheerfully saying, "Are you free Friday morning?" causes untold confusion and strained relations. Frequently, such issues can't be addressed or rectified because their technical explanation is more linguistically complex than the issue itself, and the Westerner can only let it pass and consign it to their background dejection and stress.
Word order is important in Chinese, but more for identifying which homonyms of the limited sets of sounds are being used, rather than generating wider conceptual meaning and subtle distinctions, and exampling the languages and cultures' parallel containment. Meanwhile, as Chinese writing, at least before pinyin, lacks spelling, the notion of using spelling in English to check pronunciation, and not just listening to other speakers in a groupthink society, isn't properly valued, and hence letters, along with words, are swapped around without great concern or being seen as preposterous. Chinese harmonious fitting in and only pleasing the hierarchy's next tier up translates to a concern for appearances and symbolic logographic language, whereas Western personal responsibility for themselves, irrespective of others, translates to looking inwards, beneath surfaces, and phonetic language, and then understanding how things work. However, despite authoritarianism resulting in horrors from emperors and the Mao regime, the Chinese stay with it as lacking sufficient human spirit for anything further.
By the Second Nanjing Contract, devices were set up on the front desks in all teaching rooms, requiring the lecturer to scan a phone code in order to open the computer and projected screen, after having their identity checked by facial recognition cameras for entrance on the campus, to add to assimilation into the technological control grid and presupposing state approval and permission to do anything. Alongside this, video cameras in all teaching rooms became standard, with at least one on the front and back walls in large and prominent style, for conveying plenty of mistrust in and menace towards lecturer and students alike, while also meaning there are fewer observed sessions by management or others coming in. The teaching and projected screen can be viewed remotely at any time. People consist in positions to be guided, not persons with their own sense of responsibility or with a lively internal mind to relate to. The socialist worldview is that people, or at least Chinese, need constant control, with superiors looking down from above, all as onto either sheep in a market pen or a baby in a playpen. In socialism, there are no adults, nor even a developed concept of professionalism, where staff would be acknowledged having autonomy of mind to do their job correctly. Individuality, even for the purposes of serving socialism, is inconceivable, and there is only external control, where human nature is part of a collective.
This fits with the less conscious majority in all societies, but for the more conscious, it's inhuman and offensive, while not allowing such insightful minds to rise means the society is unstable and will founder, at least when not being quietly propped up by imports from societies with better values.
The command society and the education system's listen and repeat fake learning are at one, while technology is copied rather than being developed historically, out critical and lateral thought into how practices could be improved, and isn't even reverse engineered.
The socialist environment aligns with most people's real nature, where no matter how badly the system fails the students, most foreign staff decline to stand up for students' interests, choosing to keep quiet and never making waves of any kind. Whereas capitalism and values of individuality, by contrast, facilitate speaking out and then being listened to. Staff have space to speak without being fired, and indeed can gain respect from the management, alongside their professional ethics obligations, but like the Chinese, keep quiet. Students are frequently failed by thoroughly substandard course planning, preparation, teaching, examinations, and numerous other issues, but most staff just take their money as coming in part from students' fee-paying and impoverished families. The proactive staff member may attract aversion from raising issues in both the work roles and campus, on email or chat groups from other Western staff, seeing the contradiction with the socialist containment that they've picked up on. My Zhuhai emails included concern for canteen food standards, protective fans missing above converted building entranceways beneath multiple balconies, lack of subway tunnels under the expressway recently dividing the campus, and its insufficient and unreliable pedestrian crossings, all variously violating Western building regulations. The management had had years to report all these, while the other Western staff would much rather see their own students within their duty of care poisoned, paralyzed, and dead than squeak or raise their heads over the parapet. People's core levels of consciousness, and hence intuitive and moral insight, are fixed and are mediocre in the masses. Yet, normalizing higher critical and individualist values in the background takes society forward. The more conscious critical thinker is feared on the local level, but tacitly greatly respected when their contributions materialize and raise standards. By contrast, the normalization of social over individual values and quashing of critique from insightful voices exposes most people's abjectly apathetic nature and brings the worst out of them. Living in China makes it much easier to understand figures like Stalin and Mao, who, without moderating values of individualism, saw what most people are actually like and treated them accordingly. At Zhuhai, I kept posters of both these on my apartment door to disturb the rest of the staff walking by. However, not being seen as an autonomous person with submissions to make out of perceptions and evaluations, and instead expected to deny or internalize contradictions and issues arising in an institution, causes stress across all types. At Zhuhai, I wrote harsh group emails against this, followed by disciplinary meetings 4 times with the department dean and others, and threatened with my job. But while finding that truth is a force of its own and an ally. The background web of lies about institutional education, though, caused me to increase my alcohol intake, in parallel with other staff, including very different people, but I managed to become a permanent non-drinker a couple of months after returning home. At Nanning, I was also twice called to reprimands with the dean for being proactive and hard-working, in more denial of the role's official nature, and instead the acknowledgement that it's just a form of prison guarding and authority figures to socialize the young. The disinterest in Westerners questioning values as disjunct from regimentation translates to their quality of preparation and delivery, along with enthusiasm and sensitivity counting for nothing. No managers in any job wanted even to look at my course files I'd prepared, after huge investments of time, energy, thought, and revision following live experience.
Cultures are internally consistent and integrated networks of norms and presuppositions that don't mix with others, and the uncritical, whose minds are based in nothing more objective beyond these, just don't want to know.
Despite China's remarkable development, management have limited idea of how international standard higher education courses are supposed to work, and where the lecturer speaking and presenting with slides from the front clashes with Chinese minimizing of discontinuity with the school system, where the teacher guides students through coursebook exercises at desks.
These even include demeaning multiple choice and blank space filling questions and quizzes, and most of the time, instead, I used all my own material. Management further show no interest in the standard practice of students working through a lecturer-prepared reading list from the university library, where they create an understanding for themselves, then discuss questions with the lecturer in a seminar scenario, while staff also usually have to make a special application even to gain access to the library building.
Library study desks are typically full of students in respectful silence, but self-directed private study to create a personal perspective by arguing for and against, as for international social science assessment essays, is worrisome and to be controlled. Maybe next the students will start arguing through the merits and demerits of Chinese socialism and who benefits most, as absolutely out of bounds. So instead of research, the university system emphasizes rote exercises while using the word homework instead of assignment or private study as one of the deliberate mistranslations to perpetuate school-like immaturity. Other stupid Chinese English university vocabulary for minimizing the marginal improvements over the school environment include school for university, playground for library square, classroom for lecture room or seminar room, lesson for lecture or seminar, class for group or course, play for socializing, teacher for lecturer, the students as boys, girls, kids for men, women, people, and sometimes headmaster for dean. Indeed, there's a background indifference to increasing English proficiency, where more of its articulating and argumentative features appear that can challenge anything, including wider China. There's an intentional perpetuation of errors as part of the goals of mental containment or regression in students, and quiet countermanding the outward notions of a university being for personal growth, at least beyond fitting in. Moreover, university sports days with audiences are held exactly as in primary and high school, and bring cancellations of teaching. Although, as ever, the students as less conscious are fine with all this, and it's not so degrading, while physical fitness figures in socialist theory. The classroom setting of a constant authority figure watching ominously over others is the central insistence, with students from 18 to 23 treated as and made to regard and describe themselves as children and minors. The education system's purpose is to presuppose institutional dependency and permanently extend needy, compliant, and submissive childhood as the nature of society and the rest of life, with any learning as secondary, all as favoring the existing background hierarchy and elite. Mental maturity, critique, and autonomy that higher education is at least supposed to stand for, and which benefit any society, are in direct conflict with Chinese socialism's authoritarianism, command hierarchy, internal control concerns, hive mind, harmony, and the population's innate limitations. Norms of deference to authority are further given in various uniformed officials on campus, including to direct traffic, as though people can't even get themselves around without someone else telling them how, although, again, the sheep are happy with their various sheepdogs. Then, instead of the department maintaining files of materials and methods for ongoing courses as a resource for successor staff, particularly the complex Western culture presentation courses, the capable and conscientious lecturer's efforts are contemptuously disregarded when they leave. The replacement recruit, if they don't already have their own complete course, as they usually don't, is disingenuously provided with at most a plagiarized coursebook, and hence a renewed stressful and controlling situation that again strays towards downgraded simpler schooling.
Poor staff profiles and poor preparation standards, however, are at one with most students' critical abilities, while keeping down the occasional more genuine thinker. The frequent weak recruitment isn't accidental, and even includes staff who have never had their own laptop computer nor gained familiarity with Microsoft PowerPoint, or even Word, to use in the sessions. It can be a serious loss for Western departments to lose a staff member running a developed course in the absence of a replacement with similar expertise, But here, it's an agreeable, glib matter of a new, fresh face to smudge the situation over, where demeaning surfaces are intentionally substituted for complex material and methods.
Although my first Nanjing contract particularly understood that I was reliable and capable, and I could have stayed indefinitely, they still hardly took an interest in anything I was doing. Praise and then contract renewal for staff are based on how quiet and pliant they are, not on meaningful performance reviews or proactivity, while the high staff turnover accords with them being ignored and their subsurface tensions repressed, although the managers in turn aren't expected to understand instructions coming down to them either. There may be course outline documents with weekly targets, and students fill in basic online course evaluations at the end, but most of this is ignored, and there's no sense back from the environment of fulfilling any genuine learning goals, or of exactly what anyone is doing or why. Detention camp sentries with cowardly minds looking for power relations over others are readily replaceable, so minimal effort is made to retain anyone. Humanity's average dirty washing psychology defines the entire enterprise, with professional responsibilities and duties of care a private chuckle, where the more coercion and strife impinging on both staff and students going down the chain, the better. The young are socialized into taking meaningless nonsense from superiors as how life must be, while the managers and wider hierarchy smile inwardly and clink glasses. The system has a good vomit on the students, where just under the propriety and shiny surface, everything of course is hate and revulsion for the next human being, and the possibility of their success in life. For the most part, though, garbage dumps garbage on garbage, so it matters little.
At Zhuhai, when one of our students hung herself in her dormitory, the managers, as ever, kept quiet and made no announcement, preferring to paper over her life rather than say a few words, as this might involve broaching things that could be improved or changed. You can be dead, and you're still a threat.
All as in the West, it's unclear whether institutionalized teaching at any level works or has any value whatsoever, and isn't just elite forces looking to control and keep people beneath them down, where instead people can't just learn for themselves. Once they can read, they can know all published knowledge in the world and create their own analyses and understanding without being forced into fake approval structures and pre-given paradigms from a social club that keeps itself and its groupthink in line. Real study is largely private study, where any student just needs a quiet place of their own, away from the absurd but calculated presence of others, and with well-directed quality learning materials and methods. The system wants to assume the young need not only guidance, but levels of institutional control and protective padding only suited to the insane or retarded. It says students don't know what's good for them, while quietly maintaining their ignorance of wider reality as far as it can, and with its dissociated bits of information from completely different subjects throughout the day, particularly in schooling, bringing confusion and estrangement. Regimented schools are for fish only, while human consciousness doesn't work this way, and it's almost as useless for the less aware. At times, a learner may need to be advised of what is important to know and the techniques of how to know it, but handing over one's capacity for intuitive and autonomous learning via curiosity to a third party is essentially ridiculous and only means corruption. The assumption the system issues is that it isn't possible for a person to think for or educate themselves, and instead another person must be sought, even when they're just another person, but who then also has their own and likely conflicting set of interests and agenda. At Zhuhai, my proactivity extra to contract, and its already huge course creation demands, as trying to keep to wider professional responsibility for students, included attending 35 informal English conversation evening meetings, arranging several more of these, including city excursions for a total over 50, 2 illustrated lectures in the Foreigner Lecture Series, and offers for more, speaking competition training sessions, Toastmasters public speaking group support, tutorials for the international exam, and attending their version of graduation thesis defense. Some of my disciplinary meetings here were for arguing with Chinese staff over their refusal to acknowledge bad practice in English, following an extensive presentation me and an American made to them, plus for group emailing a list of 113 recommendations for raising standards across teaching, campus, and administration. Not being able to provide an employment reference from here also meant I had difficulty applying for my next contract and had to take a simpler job at a lower-ranked university with poorer facilities and older buildings. Most foreign staff, of course, take a furtive look around any new environment to make a note of howsoever everything happens to be before vehemently defending it as though it was all their own views and where there is almost no point at which they would take a stand. With Chinese and Western education systems alike being for slotting the young into unanalyzed social order and privilege, university recruitment criteria are for various invertebrates, weather vanes, status quo followers, and shirkers without the reflectivity inherent in meaningful teaching. Problems are suppressed in the assumption they're always superficial and minor under the perfect wider administration, and where an occasional individual with concerns, who hence implies they have access to truth beyond socialism, needs a subtly condescending pat on the back and bringing round. The country is only recently developed beyond subsistence farming, and not used to considering details to Western levels, so whatever your issue is, the powers above will identify and deal with it in due time, and you can go back to being a brick in the wall. The idea of standardized practices to be recognized in a developed society, as well as in a developed language, as established over long time periods for workability, is then tenuous, and they don't so often ask questions like, "How do you do this?" or "How does it work?" Indeed, something having objectivity and independence from state directives is always a problem, so English is assumed to be far more relative in nature than it is, and where Chinese empty distortions are equivalent to international standard English with its depth of structure. Weak differentiation, however, has benefits of at least the Dongying high school teachers casually sitting and talking with students in offices, taking meals out with them, having their mobile phone numbers, and remembering birthdays with cakes and music. There was a round of applause before and after the principal spoke to students in rapport with them, while there's a Teacher's Day in October where my classes bought me a plant, cup, and cards, all unheard of in Britain, where demarked boundaries bring greater alienation and more students feeling nothing but hatred. In China, you can take a couple of charming 15-year-old girls to a restaurant for lunch, whereas in Britain, you'd be summoned to some maniac sick inquest, where Orwellian child protection rules are for stifling normal contact and curbing personal development yet further. My school never had any disciplining or shouting, with instead the education system seen as self-evidently valuable and teachers widely respected. After a few months there, I was also asked to give an hour's presentation to other staff, translated by my manager every few sentences, on my thoughts on education in the West and China, although she gave me back the first draft of my notes to tone down. To be continued. Any questions?